C.S. Lewis wrote in The Great Divorce, there are only two kinds of people in the end: those who say to God, "Thy will be done," and those to whom God says, in the end, "Thy will be done." Which one are you? Who is really Lord of your life? It is a question we come back to over and over in our faith walk with Jesus, because it's just too easy to allow someone or something besides Jesus to lord over our lives. Did you know that Jesus is Lord is the earliest Christian confession? Paul is writing to the Roman Church at a time when the Jewish Christians are being expelled, pushed out of Jerusalem. And some of them are coming to Rome, enough of them that there is a tension between the church, between the Jewish Christians and the Gentile Christians. Paul is addressing this tension in the larger context of this passage that needs to be understood. We cannot forget that Christianity grew out of the Jewish religion, and at this point, it is still seen as a Jewish sect. Paul is having to lay out the broadening plan of salvation, started with Israel, to include the Gentiles. More to the point is the issue of righteousness, to be in a right relationship with God. How do we get it, and who gets it? Paul states in chapter 9 that Israel didn't arrive at the law of righteousness because they didn't seek it by faith, but as if it were by works of the law. They stumbled over the stumbling stone. The law, which had been intended to help and to guide, became a stumbling block when Israel came to rely on the law rather than on their faith. When they sought to establish their own righteousness and failed to submit to God's righteousness. How do we get righteousness? True righteousness is a gift of God rather than something earned. Who gets it? Verse 4 tells us, Christ is the end of the law, so that there may be righteousness for everyone who believes. Everyone. No matter if saint or sinner, rich or poor, tall or short, brown-eyed, blue-eyed, green-eyed, or any other color eye. Everyone who believes Jesus is Lord, and in his resurrection is given the gift of righteousness. David Watson, in his article, Take Away Our Pride, the Lordship of Jesus, wrote, "We can labor under the illusion that we are in control of our lives, or we can accept the fact that this world is marred by sin, and we are subject to sin and death. When we submit to the Lordship of Jesus, God will overcome sin and death in our lives. When we insist on self-will, sin and death reign with even greater authority. Self-will is a delusion, and only by submission to the one true Lord can we be free. Jesus is Lord is a heart statement, a whole being statement, not just an intellectual statement. Heart belief is at the wellspring of our core of being, and it brings us into a right relationship with God. It determines not only what we think, but also how we act in the direction that our lives will take. Just look at Paul, who was Saul. Jesus met him on the road to Damascus, where he was headed to persecute Christians, to bring them back into line, even if it meant that some or all would die. He went from persecuting Jesus' followers to proclaiming that Jesus is Lord. Let me give you another example. I like history and facts that I don't know. Before I read an article called Discipleship in Quarantine by Beth Felker Jones, in which she talks about Julian of Norwich. She talks about her life and the direction her life took. What I knew about Julian was that she was a mystic. She lived her life in prayerful contemplation of God in the 14th and 15th century. We have even used some of her call to worships as part of our worship in this church. What I didn't realize or think about is she lived in essence two lives. The first in the world, a life of education, household concerns. She would run into neighbors on the street and say hello. She had relationships with friends and family. We don't know if she was married or not. Some say that she wasn't, and others say that probably she was. Then the bubonic plague swept through the town of Norwich, not once but twice in her lifetime. A third of Europe's population was taken out by this pandemic. At some point in time, Julian's life in the world ended, and her second life as an anchoress began. The life of an anchoress, or an anchorite if you were a man, was a dedicated ministry to a church in a town. This is the strange part and where the name comes from. They would be walled into a cell or an anchor hold attached to the church. Not buried alive, although she would not leave her cell until her death, Julian would have 3 windows, one to the street, one to the sanctuary, and one to care for her needs. Food, laundry, books, chamber pot. I think you get the idea. Even though she was to live a life set apart, it was still a life in the world. She was there to pray in place, to pray for the church, the town, and the world. If you had a prayer concern at any time, day or night, you knew where you could find Julian, and you could talk to her through the window. Don't get any ideas. I can't imagine living the rest of my life in a 9 by 11 foot cell. And that is why I am so fascinated and so impressed by her devotion and her dedication. Because this was not something she was forced to do. She would have entered the cell on her own free will. In one of her visions, she saw Christ's blood flowing abundantly for us, flowing freely in the world that seems to be crumbling. To her, it told her that he is with us, he is for us. For truly, says Julian, it is the most joy that can be, as I see it, that he is the highest and the mightiest, the noblest and wealthiest, is also lowest and meekest, most friendly and most gracious. There is no question that Jesus is Lord in her life. She proclaimed it in the choices that she made on how she lived her life. Paul went on to write, "For everyone who calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved." And then he asked 4 questions. But how are they to call on one in whom they have not believed? And how are they to believe in one of whom they have never heard? And how are they to hear without someone to proclaim him? And how are they to proclaim him unless they are sent? Jesus is Lord is more than a confession. It signifies our relationship with God, and it contains a call on our lives, requiring action as a response. For you who are believers, followers of Jesus Christ, who say Jesus is Lord, you need to have a burden for people like the Apostle Paul and Julian of Norwich. Not saying that you're going to be called to the extent that they were, but we have that call on our lives. We need to be a light in the darkness, a voice in His name. If you don't believe, I believe and have faith that God is working in you, no matter who you are or what you've done. I think it's only appropriate that we close with a prayer that Julian of Norwich wrote. God is all that is good, has made all that is made, and loves all He has made. So he who loves all his fellow Christians for God's sakes loves all that is made. Amen.